Hi everyone. I'm Andrew Kunzman, the Senior Epidemiologist within the IARC Monographs program. On behalf of IARC, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar on bias assessment in case control and cohort studies for hazard identification. We have over 300 registrants to the webinar today from multiple countries and continents, and welcome today. This webinar is being broadcasted without warranty of any kind, either expressed or implied, and please note that the authors alone are responsible for the views expressed in this webinar. The editors would like to acknowledge funding from IARC and the United States National Cancer Institute for contributing to the funding of this publication. As some rules, all participants are muted, but we still welcome questions via the Q&A panel. Please send any questions at any time during the presentations and sign with your name and affiliation. Ideally, also add your chapter number or the person you're asking the question to, if applicable. Questions are visible to all participants, and you're able to vote on questions to help us identify the best ones and the ones that are most of interest to you. Questions will be compiled and answered at the end of the webinar. We have about a 15-minute schedule, but please feel free to write questions in the Q&A panel as they come to your mind. There's also a chat function that you may use to send us messages in case of technical problems. Finally, the recording of this webinar will be shared with all registrants at a later date. The aims of the workshop and the related publication were to develop a toolkit for epidemiological and statistical methods to assess bias impact in published epidemiological studies with a focus on hazard identification. The toolkit is intended to help epidemiologists or statisticians to appraise or conduct primary studies, validation studies, or evidence syntheses. The book includes some worked examples from previous IARC evaluations to help explain some of the concepts. And the book builds upon work earlier reported in the Breslow and Day books. A scientific workshop was held here in Lyon in October 2022, which involved 37 experts in epidemiological methods and the IARC Secretariat. At the workshop, the experts discussed the outline of the book, the bias assessment approaches useful for hazard identification, and the examples and text to best describe these approaches. As well as the authors, I'd also like to thank the technical team here at IARC, without which this book wouldn't have been possible. The book was recently published online and will be soon available in hard copy. The book includes chapters on a wide range of topics listed here related to bias assessment for hazard identification. These include chapters related to confounding, chapters related to other forms of bias, and guidance on the reporting and use of tools. Each chapter will be described today by one of the contributing authors. And with that in mind, I'm pleased to introduce Mary Schubauer-Berigan, head of the IARC Monographs program, who is lead author of Chapter 1 on the role of epidemiology in cancer hazard identification by the IARC Monographs program. Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. It's delightful to be here to talk with you about Chapter 1 of this book, which is concerned with the role of epidemiology in cancer hazard identification as practiced by the IARC Monographs program. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Rodolfo Sirachi, who was instrumental in the development of this chapter. First, I need to introduce you to the IARC Monographs, which is a comprehensive global program of cancer hazard identification. The monographs evaluate chemicals, physical and biological agents, pharmaceuticals, metals, particles, and fibers, complex mixtures, and occupational circumstances, really the breadth of preventable causes of human cancer. Since 1971, more than 1,400 scientists from 59 countries have participated in monographs meetings, and 548 agents have been classified as carcinogenic, probably carcinogenic, or possibly carcinogenic to humans. The IARC Monographs evaluations are carried out in a 5-step systematic review process by working groups of experts in the literature on a given agent. Different working groups are assembled for each new volume. Their assessments are guided by the preamble to the IARC Monographs, which lays out all the methods used in the evaluation. The monographs evaluations are carried out by working groups of independent scientific experts who are free from conflicts of interest, and they are the ones who review the science and develop the evaluations. They're assisted in this by the IARC Secretariat, who coordinate all aspects of the evaluation and ensure adherence to the preamble. 3 streams of evidence are evaluated by working groups: cancer in humans, cancer in experimental animals, and mechanistic evidence. These are integrated to reach an overall evaluation. In addition, exposure is characterized within each monograph. The evidence on cancer in humans is synthesized into one of 4 possible categories for each cancer type: sufficient, limited, inadequate, and evidence suggesting lack of carcinogenicity, or ESLC. To reach sufficient evidence, the working group judges that a causal relationship has been established, in that there's a positive association in the body of evidence, and that chance, bias, and confounding can all be ruled out with reasonable confidence. For a limited determination, a positive association is credible, but chance, bias, and/or confounding could not be ruled out with reasonable confidence. For an inadequate determination, the studies permit no conclusion about a causal association, and there is specific guidance as well for the ESLC categorization. Human cancer evidence is extremely important to the monographs classification. A determination of sufficient evidence for one or more cancer types in humans will automatically lead to a Group 1 classification. If no cancer types have sufficient evidence, but there are one or more cancer types with limited evidence, then these can combine with either sufficient evidence for cancer in animals or strong mechanistic evidence, or both, to lead to a Group 2A evaluation. Thus, you can see the importance of examining whether biases can explain positive findings for the human cancer evidence, which is based largely upon observational epidemiology studies. Working groups examine both study quality and study informativeness. Study quality pertains to the quality of the assessment of exposure and cancer outcome, potential for selection bias, whether confounding was adequately considered, the quality of the data collection methods, and the appropriateness of the statistical analysis methods. Study informativeness is slightly different, and this relates to the ability to detect the presence of a true association or the absence of a null association. It goes beyond considerations of study power and considers the presence of an exposure contrast, the adequacy of latency or of exposure windows that are relevant to the development of cancer, and exposure to the target organ. The body of human cancer evidence is synthesized using an adaptation of the approaches suggested by Sir Austin Bradford Hill. The strength of the association is important. However, weak associations may indeed be causal. The consistency of the association can be important to consider. However, it must account for differences in study quality and study informativeness. The presence of an exposure response is thought to provide strong evidence for a causal association. However, absence does not necessarily imply the absence of a causal association. The temporality of the association is a necessity, and this is often an area of much discussion in working group meetings. The biological plausibility is interesting because much of this is discussed as a separate evidence stream in the mechanistic evidence. However, considerations of latency, dose to target organ would be factored in here. All of these considerations are described in the monograph's preamble. As we start thinking about the book, I wanted to point out some challenges in evidence synthesis for hazard identification by using questions posed by recent working groups during their deliberations. For example, could selection bias caused by differential participation rates of cases and controls completely explain an odds ratio of 2 in this key study of night shift work? Is confounding by co-exposure to arsenic likely to explain the excess lung cancer seen for antimony among smelter workers? Could smoking confounding completely explain the elevated risk of bladder cancer in these key studies of opium consumption? What's the relative importance of non-differential measurement error versus recall bias in studies of mobile phone radiation or red meat? There are a number of challenges in evidence synthesis for hazard identification. As you can see, the consideration of the roles of confounding and bias is essential to the evaluations, but we find there's minimal guidance on methods to formally evaluate direction and magnitude of biases in the context of cancer hazard identification. We also noted that there has been a recent, somewhat problematic focus on algorithmic scoring approaches when describing observational epidemiology studies. Examples that are carried through the publication draw upon some agents that have limited evidence for cancer in humans, including night shift work, radiofrequency electromagnetic field radiation, or RFEMF, red meat consumption, as well as an agent recently evaluated and found to have sufficient evidence for cancer types in humans, which is opium consumption. You'll be hearing more about examples throughout this webinar and throughout the book. I'd now like to turn to the question of whether expert judgments are robust. We have a way to look at this because the IARC Monographs Volume 100, 15 years ago, evaluated about 100 Group 1 agents that had been evaluated by previous working groups, and they were reevaluated again. Nearly all were reaffirmed as Group 1. In fact, there was only one agent, a single HPV type, which was reclassified into Group 2A. For many of these, the evidence had strengthened since the previous evaluation. There was also broad concordance across the Group 1 evaluations with evaluations that have been carried out by other hazard identification programs that use different approaches. Well, what about agents that have inadequate evidence in humans? In 1985, a workshop was convened in Oxford to discuss interpretations of the so-called negative evidence in human studies for 10 agents that had sufficient evidence from animal bioassays. For most of these agents, the workshop participants concluded the evidence was likely to forever remain inadequate or even as evidence suggesting lack of carcinogenicity. Well, what happened since? In subsequent years, 3 of the 10 agents were found to have sufficient evidence and 4 were found to have limited evidence in humans. Improvements in epidemiologic study number, quality, and informativeness were key to these changes. I'll close by giving you a brief look at the breadth of recent carcinogenicity evaluations by the Monographs program. Since Volume 100, more than 135 environmentally relevant agents have been evaluated or reevaluated by the Monographs. This schema shows their classifications, with Group 1 in the center, moving outward to Group 3 at the periphery, and they're grouped by agent type and colored by the evidence stream that contributed to the evaluation. Notably, nearly all Group 1 agents are colored black, meaning that they have contributions from multiple evidence streams. It is quite rare for human cancer evidence to form the sole basis for an evaluation. In Group 2A, there are numerous instances of limited human cancer evidence, combining with either mechanistic or bioassay evidence to reach that category. This figure well illustrates the important yet complementary role of human cancer evidence in Monographs evaluations. As mentioned earlier by Andrew, we are grateful for the funding of IARC and the NCI Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics for funding this workshop and subsequent publication. Now I am pleased to introduce Professor Matt Fox, lead author of Chapter 2 on causal diagrams to evaluate sources of bias. Professor Fox, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary, and hopefully you can all see my screen. So in this chapter, we introduce sources of bias that may be relevant to the considerations that have just been discussed. And we do this in the context of causal diagrams, more formally directed acyclic graphs, which we find very useful for describing and evaluating different sources of bias. And this chapter was done with colleagues Onya Ra, Sonia Swanson, and Vivian Villalon. So the reason for using causal diagrams is that when we look at the evidence for various sources of causal relationships in the study of cancer, we have data that can point us to whether or not an association between postulated exposure and an outcome exists, but we also know that there are other reasons why we may observe an association that is not reflective of causation. Those are our sources of systematic error. And causal diagrams, in particular directed acyclic graphs, are a very useful tool for both displaying those sources of bias, but also for identifying sources of bias that one may not have thought of. And then using these diagrams, one can evaluate the likelihood of causation more robustly because one has a more complete picture of the potential explanations for an association beyond just causation. So in terms of what causal diagrams are and directed acyclic graphs, I've presented here one directed acyclic graph, and I do want to say up front that all of the diagrams you're going to see are simplified versions of what a full causal diagram is, meant to simply represent a particular component of the relationship. But what they are graphical tools for representing causal relationships between variables. Now, they are made up of nodes. Nodes are just the variables that lead to the data that we observe. And to just be clear, we are describing the process by which we get to the data that we observe. So it isn't just the data set that we have access to, but it is the entire mechanism by which the data gets generated, or referred to as a data generating mechanism. And then there are directed edges. Those are arrows which point from one variable to another. And those arrows encode causation, meaning if I draw an arrow from one variable to another, I am saying that I believe there is a causal relationship. And in order to be useful to us for diagnosing causation, it must be acyclic, meaning there should be no place in the DAG that I can start and follow the arrows and get back to where I started. And that's just required because we need the temporality assumptions. And we can use these diagrams to help communicate, but also to analyze sources of bias. And they make our assumptions explicit and testable. So DAGs are made up of three different types of structures. The first are chains. So that's what you see on the top right. And chains represent causation. So that can be direct causation. Red meat may directly affect colorectal cancer, or indirect. Red meat may affect colorectal cancer through BMI. We can also have forks. Those are pathways that in which we go from one variable to another. So in this case, colorectal cancer family history, to two different variables, what we often refer to as common causes. And forks are what lead to confounding pathways. So those are biasing pathways. And then finally, we have colliders. Colliders are when two variables have an arrow into a third variable. So in this case, red meat causing hospitalization, leading to increased risk of hospitalization, as does colorectal cancer. And those pathways don't create any bias unless we adjust for them, and then they can create bias. So as we said, confounding can be represented in causal diagrams through these fork structures. And the key aspect of confounding, or common causes, or these fork structures, is they lead to bias pathways. They create non-causal associations between the two variables, so in this case, red meat and colorectal cancer, and they have to be identified and adjusted for in order to get at causal estimates. So using causal diagrams, we can identify the biasing pathways and then look to see whether the literature being used to try and assess causation has adjusted for a sufficient set of variables to remove all the confounding pathways that we would be concerned about. DAGs can also be used to describe selection bias. So I mentioned there is this second structure, or third structure, called colliders. And colliders in themselves don't actually create any bias. But when we condition meaning here very generally, we can do that statistically, or we can limit our sample to just one subset of a population. When we do that, we create selection bias. So in this case, if we have a relationship between red meat and colorectal cancer that we're trying to establish whether or not there is a causal relationship, but both in the data set that we're using a data set in which we're only looking at those who are hospitalized. By limiting to the strata of only those who are hospitalized, we create, in addition to any causal relationship, we add on to that a non-causal relationship, in this case represented by the dotted line, between red meat and colorectal cancer by conditioning on a common effect. So when we condition on colliders, we create non-causal associations between the two variables that have arrows into them. And this is what we think of as selection bias. And that can occur lots of different ways, whether it's at study recruitment, through loss of follow-up, through missing data, or analytic decisions that we make in which we condition on these variables that are colliders. There are lots of different ways to think about selection bias, but almost all of them can be represented through this conditioning on a collider mechanism. And so typically we think of selection bias as conditioning on one of these variables that is a common effect of two other variables. We can also use causal diagrams or DAGs to describe measurement error. I will say they're used less commonly to describe measurement error, but we can actually use them. So here, if you look in the top, we have two variables that we're interested in the relationship between a causal relationship between red meat consumption and colorectal cancer. But the starred versions here represent the measured versions. So we typically don't have a perfect assessment of the variables that we are interested in studying. And so those starred variables are what we actually have access to in our data set. We can then, in the middle diagram, represent the reasons for the lack of perfect measurement through these U mechanisms, and that just represents the mechanisms by which any measurement error or misclassification occurs. And then in the third variable, the third diagram, we can represent different types of measurement error or misclassification. So in this case, you can see there's an arrow from the colorectal cancer to the error mechanism for classifying or measuring red meat consumption. And so that allows us to describe different types of measurement error. So we can have non-differential measurement error, that's represented in the middle one, where none of the actual various variables themselves affect the classification of the additional variables. But in the bottom, we have the differential misclassification, where the mismeasurement of red meat consumption is actually related to colorectal cancer, and that would be an example of something like recall bias. The key point about measurement error is that this can lead to bias in any direction. When it's non-differential, the bias is typically towards the null, but with other mechanisms, it can be away from the null. And so by diagramming out the types of measurement error that we see in studies, again, we can use it to evaluate whether or not we think that the literature we're using to assess causation is truly giving us causal estimates, or whether it's mixing together any causal estimates with biasing pathways. So the way that we typically use DAGs are, we start by drawing out all the relevant variables in that data generating mechanism that I described. Then we draw arrows between them to describe any causal relationships we identify. Then we look for what are called backdoor paths. Those are those mechanisms that I described earlier, in which we have confounding structures, common causes. Then we look to see, are there any sets of variables that need to be adjusted for in order to get at causation? And then we can compare that to what was actually adjusted for in any particular study. And finally, we can look for any selection or information bias to compare that back to what we observed. And I'll just note there are some online tools that can be used for drawing DAGs. One is called Dagity, and then there's the Causal Fusion platform. One other additional thing we can do with DAGs is we can use what are called sign DAGs. And sign DAGs allow us to just put plus or minus signs on the different arrows, indicating whether the arrow increases the risk of the outcome or decreases the risk. And by doing that, we can follow just sort of rules of math to determine whether any biasing pathways are likely to be in the positive or upward direction or in the downward direction. So we just simply multiply. If there's a positive and a negative, we would multiply those two together and get a negative. So we would expect a downward bias of this XY relationship here. And so these DAGs are useful for identifying any, not just any biases, but the direction that those biases might go. We can also use DAGs for identifying multiple sources of bias, which is useful in cases where different sources of bias may come together. But sometimes that means we need multiple different DAGs to represent different sets of assumptions, different sets of assumptions that we may have. And then use those to determine whether or not, again, we think that the the literature we're looking at is actually estimating causal effects. So just to summarize, DAGs are incredibly useful for making the assumptions that we're using to determine causation explicit. They help us identify sources of bias, given any kind of backdoor paths we might observe, and they help us to support the conclusions that we draw. There are some limitations in that they cannot show the magnitude of bias, and sometimes they do oversimplify complex relationships, and they do require subject matter expertise. But overall, they are a great way to represent your assumptions and to make clear whether you think that the associations you're looking at are truly causal relationships. So now I'm pleased to introduce Professor David Richardson, lead author of Chapter 3 on Confounding, a Routine Concern in the Interpretation of Epidemiologic Studies. Dr. Richardson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I'm going to be talking about what's called Chapter 3 in this book. And let me start by acknowledging the team that's worked on this chapter: Sadie Costello, Jay Kaufman, Caitlin Kelly-Reif, Sarah Lewis, Kyle Steenlin, and Eric Chechen. And I'd also like to acknowledge Sandra Greenland, who provided valuable feedback. The chapter focuses on confounding, which is informally described in the book as a bias that arises when an agent that's under study and the cancer outcome of interest share a common cause. A reasonable concern might be that the observed association between these two measured variables is due in part or entirely to a common cause of both of them. That's the concern that we wish to address in this chapter. In an IARC monograph meeting, a routine question that comes up is, can we reasonably rule out confounding? And that conversation typically starts by considering what's been done to control confounding in a particular study. So there'll be consideration of the study design, because it's possible to control for confounding in the design of a study, the study setting, because confounding structures are not necessarily universal or invariant over time. So decisions regarding where a study is set can help to minimize confounding. And also considering the set of variables or covariates that were measured and adjusted for. Because in observational epidemiology, a standard approach to the problem of confounding is to measure the important factors and adjust for them in the analysis. So the scale here has those approaches weigh on one side of the scale as we consider whether we can reasonably rule out confounding as an explanation for an observed association. But on the other side of the scale are the limitations of the approaches that have been used in a given study. The ways that those might come under consideration might begin with the limitations raised by the authors themselves in the discussion of their paper. But you go beyond that to the limitations that an IARC reviewer might raise based on their knowledge and understanding about established causes of the cancer that's under investigation, those causes that remain uncontrolled for in the study, and considerations about whether it's plausible that those are associated with the exposure. In addition, a reviewer might raise concerns about the confounders that were adjusted for and how they were measured and modeled, that is, residual confounding. So control for confounding is rarely, if ever, perfect. Control is a matter of degree. In my experience, in a review that takes place in a monograph, critical discussion about the potential impact of unmeasured confounders often precedes one confounder at a time. A review is strengthened and the argument sort of can probe deeper by explaining which factors were considered as potential confounders, why they were considered, and their likely effects. Many, but not all, of the methods and approaches that are discussed in Chapter 3 are premised on the ability that we can name the potential confounding factor of concern and then interrogate it. One of those tools, which Matt mentioned, is assigned directed acyclic graph, assigned DAG, partly because the very process of drawing assigned DAG requires that a reviewer is obliged to hypothesize about why a potential confounder is associated with the exposure and why it's associated with the cancer outcome of concern. In addition, to posit the directions of those associations. So we have blue arrows and we have red signs indicating the directions. In the example, a family history of disease increases the risk that the person in the study is subsequently going to develop colorectal cancer. A positive sign is noted, indicating a positive association between the confounder and the outcome. And a family history of the disease is associated with red meat consumption because the reviewer is positing that people who come from families with a history of cancer may tend to eat less red meat. So a negative sign is noted. With assigned DAG, we can refer to the table or the multiplication of those two signs and conclude that the probable net bias in the association between red meat consumption and colorectal cancer in a study in which family history of disease wasn't adjusted for would be downward bias or negative. It wouldn't entirely explain an observed positive association in an association that didn't adjust for it. It would attenuate or mask it. Another tool that's sometimes used to assess confounding in published studies that draws on the logic of negative control outcomes or negative control exposures and proxies. Chapter 3 addresses those methods altogether because they all share a similar causal structure between the variables, which is illustrated in that white box. For example, consider a cohort study where information has been collected on a cancer outcome of interest, as well as other outcomes. For example, different categories of cause of death that we don't believe are caused by the exposure. If a published study provides an estimate of the association between the exposure of interest and a cancer outcome of interest, and it also reports estimates of associations between that exposure and negative control outcomes, absence of evidence of an association between the exposure and the negative control outcome could be helpful in nullifying sort of claims of confounding by an unmeasured factor. Chapter 3 lays out some of the key assumptions in order for that logic to work. Exposure does not cause the negative control outcome, and the confounder that we've posited of concern has a causal effect on that negative control outcome. So in a hypothetical example, again, we're interested in the effect of red meat consumption on colorectal cancer. Tobacco smoking is an unmeasured potential confounder. An investigator might posit that emphysema would be a reasonable negative control outcome. The key assumption, red meat consumption does not cause emphysema, and tobacco use causes emphysema. If those assumptions are correct, the absence of an association between red meat consumption and emphysema would help to nullify claims that tobacco is an important confounder of the association of interest, i.e. the red meat colorectal cancer association. Chapter 3 also introduces several simple bias analysis methods or calculations. One is if a reviewer proposes that an established cancer risk factor might be an uncontrolled confounder, then the reviewer can examine the magnitude of that confounder's association with the cancer outcome of interest based on prior studies. If the magnitude of that association is less than the observed association in the study, then the confounding by that factor can't entirely explain the observed association. This intuition is symmetrical, in fact. Both the underlying associations between the unmeasured confounder and exposure and unmeasured confounder and outcome, not just one of them, both of them must be larger than the published relative risk estimate for the association of interest. Sometimes reviewers, as I said, wish to express a general concern, not a particular concern about unmeasured confounder, but a general concern that the observed association between exposure and disease might be confounded by a factor, but it's as yet unknown. So an unknown unmeasured confounder. One approach that's been used is calculation of what's called an E-value, as proposed as a way of assessing whether an unobserved positive exposure outcome association could entirely be due to an unknown confounder, U. The E-value is calculated as the observed, potentially confounded relative risk between exposure and disease, plus the square root of the product of that relative risk and what would be the excess relative risk. You can quickly calculate that by hand. That value is a way of assessing what magnitude of association would be required between the unknown confounder and exposure and the unknown confounder and disease under the assumption that they're both equal and they would need to be equal to that e-value or greater. So there's an appeal to the e-value in that it's derived just using the published potentially confounded association between the agent and the outcome. But less appealing is that it's got some pretty strong assumptions. One of them I said, the equivalence of the two legs of that confounding triangle. Another one being, for example, that the prevalence of that unmeasured confounder among the exposed is 100%. So in chapter 3, really what we end up encouraging is that reviewers of articles allow themselves to relax those assumptions. And one way is simply to use calculators in spreadsheets that we point to in the book to calculate bias-adjusted estimates of associations under a range of scenarios, which can encompass the e-value scenario, but is much more flexible and often much more plausible scenarios. So to wrap up, in chapter 3, we talk through how reviewers in a principled manner can address the question, can we reasonably rule out confounding as an explanation for an observed association? The reviewers will want to consider what steps were taken in the study to address confounding through design, study setting and adjustment. The reviewers want to consider whether there are likely to be important unmeasured confounders that could possibly explain the association, and then turn to tools to assess residual confounding. Many of these are leveraging judgments about the causal structures to assess the potential direction of the bias and indirectly assess evidence of bias, either using negative controls or proxies. And then there are other tools that quantify the magnitude of the bias using simple calculators. Just let me close by saying, when answering questions about unobserved factors, the reliability of such judgments tends to be greatly improved when we make use of background or external information. And when our evaluations are transparent, we clearly state our assumptions. I think what chapter 3 really does a service is laying out a simple set of tools for assessing unmeasured confounding and what those key assumptions are, so that reviewers can discuss those and weigh those. Now I'm pleased to introduce Professor Leslie Stayner, who is the lead author of chapter 4. Professor Stayner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Pleased to present the chapter 4 on measurement, error, and misclassification of exposure and disease. I've got a very long list of authors here, so I won't name them all, but a very talented group for discussing a very difficult problem. Oh boy. Okay, well, I thought I'd start with this quote from Socrates, that the only thing I know for sure is that I know nothing at all for sure. And I think it's apropos for us to acknowledge at the start that exposure and disease misclassification, especially exposure misclassification, is a problem for just about all cancer epidemiology, or at least studies that I'm aware of. So let's see, I'm having trouble changing slides. So broadly, we can classify errors in exposure as being non-differential, that is in relation to disease, or differential. So I'll start by talking about non-differential. And it's often assumed that if the errors are non-differential with respect to disease, then the bias is towards the null. So this is, something that's been commonly stated in many epidemiologic studies. I have to say, in my own case, I've used it many times. But it's not always true. It's true on average in certain circumstances that I'll discuss, but not always. And the direction of the bias is actually determined by the type of exposure metric, that is, whether it's continuous or categorical, and the error model. So we talk about categorical exposures. It's been well established that when we're talking about a binary exposure measure, that is a yes/no exposure variable, the error on average, again, is always biased towards the null. But it's more complicated when we talk about analyses using several categories of exposure, which may result in overestimation of risk in the intermediate categories and underestimation of risk in the highest categories. For continuous exposure variables, the direction depends on the error model that's involved. So here's several models that have been used. Classical model is one that might be used with laboratory measurements. A linear model is a model where there's some correction for bias with having a slope and an intercept, and then a Berrington model. So the importance of this is that when we're dealing with classical errors, we do expect that there's an underestimation of the dose-response relationship, or bias towards the null, in other words. And when we're talking about Bergsonian errors, which are, by the way, very common in occupational cancer studies, where we group people in exposure by job category and time. And when you have Bergsonian errors, they're generally expected to not bias the dose-response relationship, but do increase the variance. And just to emphasize, any study may, in fact, obtain a result that is biased away from the null or biased towards the null due just to random variability. So similar to what David was showing in our chapter, we use some fairly simple tools to demonstrate what can be done to quantify bias due to misclassification. And here's an example using, well, this is just a formula. If you know the sensitivity and specificity, or you're willing to make a guess, you can apply these formulas to come up with corrected classified cases and controls. And here's an example that we used from a study by Fritchie et al. On breast cancer and graveyard shift work. We assumed that the cases and controls both have the same sensitivity and specificity. And see in the yellow box is the results from the observed study. Graveyard shift at an odds ratio of 1.16, and then the adjusted value was 1.29. So here's a demonstration of where there was an increase in the association once we corrected for bias due to the sensitivity and specificity were equal in the cases and controls. So that's non-differential for differential misclassification of exposure. The chapter talks about a number of things. David already covered negative controls, so I won't spend any time on that. But we can also look at positive controls, examine whether that other outcomes that are known to be associated with exposure, that we see that the magnitude of that association is consistent with the literature. We can look at other sources of exposure on prevalence of exposure and see if it's similar to the source population, stratified by whether the interviews were done by proxies or by the individuals. And finally, triangulation, where we look whether there's several studies and looking at to see whether there's more convincing evidence than looking at just one study. We can also use these bias analyses tools for differential errors. So here's an example using data from a study of opium use and head and neck cancer. And the study was actually had measured using a biomarker, had developed estimates of sensitivity and specificity, and they differed slightly among the cases and controls. So in the study, the odds ratio was 5.33. When it was adjusted for bias, it was increased to 7.19. So this is just one example. Here the bias was towards the null, but just to emphasize it could be either way with differential errors. So these simple methods I was showing with the spreadsheets that are, by the way, online available from Matthew Fox and Tim Lash's book. But you can also, I don't have time to present it, but in the chapter we try to illustrate multidimensional analyses where we vary the specificity and sensitivity, multiple categories analyses, and probabilistic analyses, which includes the uncertainty related to the sensitivity and specificity measures. So here's an example of that from that head and neck and opium use study again. There's you can see a distribution now of errors, and the median is higher than the naive, or I'm sorry, it's lower than the naive odds ratio. But here's the distribution. And I think is a very useful illustration. So several other advanced methods are reviewed in our chapter. These generally require access to individual data or validation data, which is something that might be rarely available to IARC in its monographs. But we talked about regression calibration, simulation extrapolation, Bayesian methods, and multiple imputation. So I focused my talk here on misclassification of exposure, but we also review the chapter misclassification of disease, which is generally less common source of information bias than exposure misclassification, but may in certain circumstances be quite a serious issue. And these errors, when they're non-differential with respect to exposure, will on average, again, result in bias towards a null in most cases. And the methods that we describe in the chapter for adjusting for exposure misclassification may also be applied to bias analyses for disease outcomes. So finally, to err is human, to correct one's errors is divine. I think this being involved in this chapter has made me humble about how difficult it is to have complete confidence in what one can correct for our errors. But hopefully it also points us in a direction to getting the kind of information we need to do a better job in characterizing our uncertainty. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Lorenzo Richardson, who's an author on Chapter 5 on selection bias.
I hope you can see better now. Hello, everyone. And I'm going to speak about the Chapter 5 on selection bias. Here you can see the cohorters, including Neil Pierce, who was the leading author of this chapter. So I'm going to first give a very brief definition of selection bias. This because there is no unanimous consensus of what selection bias is. And so it's useful to give a definition at the beginning. And then I will speak about the identification of selection bias in cohort and case control studies. And then the assessment, which is the main focus of selection bias, will be the third topic of this presentation. So let's start with a definition. And I start with this very simple diagram in which we have the three main populations of interest for epidemiological studies. So the target population, which is the population to which we would like to apply our results. But then when we do a study, we have to start by defining very carefully our source population. And then eventually the study will be carried out on the proportion of the source population, which is the study population. However, in reality, in most studies, the concept of the target population is really left undefined. So you can see here the dashed line, and we define only the source population and the study population. And these are the two key elements that we should consider when speaking about selection bias. So this brings us to the definition of selection bias that we used in the chapter. So there is the difference between the source population, the target population, which is an issue of transportability and lack of transportability, while selection bias mainly refers to the difference between the study population and the source population. And we have selection bias when the estimate in the study population is different from that in the source population, and is also non-causal. And this happens because of selective recruitment or loss to follow-up. And this definition is particularly relevant within the context of IARC monograph, as it is of concern in IARC monograph if an exposure has a non-null causal effect in a defined source population or even a specific study population, while transportability is less relevant, and also selection effect modifier is less relevant. So this is the definition that we used in the chapter. And then I'm going to present the main types, let's say, of selection bias that we discussed. So here you can see a diagram, again, very simplified, of a cohort study. We have the exposure, then we have a latency period, and then the risk period starts with a follow-up. And typically we have the T0 at the beginning of the risk period. So we have several sources of selection bias. First of all, we might have non-response at baseline, and this introducing selection bias if the exposure and the future outcome risk affect the non-response. And this is typically not a severe form of selection bias. What typically matters the most is loss to follow-up, and this may introduce selection bias if attrition is associated with the exposure and with the outcome. Then we have other types of selection bias. For example, we have incorrect specification of time zero. We might start the follow-up before the actual beginning of the risk period, for example, as shown here in the diagram. Or we might have a left truncation, and in which we start the follow-up after the beginning of the risk period, and we include in the cohort members with prevalent exposure. And finally, we discuss in the chapter the issue of the insufficient follow-up due to right truncation, in which we stop the follow-up before the members of the cohort have actually have the possibility to develop the cancer after or because of the exposure. When it comes to case control studies, we have the same, all the biases that I have just shown in the previous slide, which are seen for cohort study, can occur in a corresponding case control study based on the same source population and followed up over the same period. But then we have also types of selection bias which are related to the specific design in case control studies. And these are related to the selection of the cases. For example, when we exclude case participants based on previous history of cancer, they are based on the selection of controls, population controls, hospital controls, and then the most severe, typically the most severe form of selection bias in case control studies related to participation of cases and controls. And there is a potential for selection bias when both the disease and the exposure status affect participation in the study. I now move on speaking about the assessment of selection bias, which is, as I was saying, really the main focus of the chapter. So the first point, which I think is very relevant, is selection does not always imply selection bias. So one thing is selection, another thing is selection bias. And also selection bias is often the most mathematically simple bias for which estimates of effect can be bias adjusted, which is good. But however, the information needed for such bias adjustment, unfortunately, is rarely available or reported in published papers. And also most published studies provide little or no discussion, or let's say little discussion of the potential for selection bias. So when we read a paper for the monographs, we should find some tools to assess whether selection bias was relevant or not for the study results. And here I summarize some of the tools that are discussed in the chapter. So the first one is to use substantive knowledge. We have heard about the DAX in the previous presentation for considering whether selection bias is possible and evaluating any strategies that the authors may have adopted to minimize, control for, or assess it. For example, try to think about what are the main determinants of selection in a given study. Then we have negative control exposure or negative control outcome approaches, and these have been also described in a previous presentation. Basically, this implies the assessment of the association with another exposure or outcome, which is believed not to be associated with the outcome of the exposure of interest, but is subject to, in this case, a similar selection bias. We can reanalyze published data. For example, we can do a dose response analysis in the exposed if we think that exposure itself is a driver of selection. And then we can compare our results, the results of the study, of a published study with external data. For example, we can compare the prevalence of exposure in the study with the prevalence of exposure in the source population, and this information is available. We can use several control groups if they are expected to produce selection bias in opposite directions. And we can do comparison of the results for different studies, for example, separating studies with population controls and those with hospital controls. Here in the bottom part on the slide, you can see an example taken from the book. It's example 5.27, based on Shakeri et al. Publication 2012, and they conducted 2 case control studies of open use endosophageal cancer in the same region, the Islamic Republic of Iran. They were conducted by the same group with a similar study design, except for the use of hospital versus population-based controls. And the prevalence of open use was 16% in a cohort enrolled in the same geographical area. So that was external data, while the prevalence of open use was 17% among the controls, population-based controls, and 23% among the hospital-based controls. So this means that the results based on hospital-based controls were actually biased downwards. And the last slide is about the adjustment for selection bias, quantitative adjustment. This is an example in a case control study. The table is again taken from the book. You can see that you have the true cell counts and the observed cell counts, and this kind of 4 parameters that can be used to adjust your odds ratio. The formula is quite simple, as I was saying before, and is reporting here in the bottom left part of the slides. To make things a bit more complicated, it's possible to add uncertainty calculated from the bias odds ratio. It's also possible to conduct multidimensional bias analysis, changing the bias parameters, and it's also possible to conduct probabilistic bias analysis by sampling from the parameter distribution. This was all regarding Chapter 5 on selection bias. So now I'm pleased to introduce Professor Amy Berrington de Gonzalez, who is the lead author of Chapter 6 on incorporating bias assessments into evidence synthesis. So Professor Berrington de Gonzalez, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. So we've heard now an overview of a wide variety of methods that can be used for assessing bias in published studies. And so in this chapter, we evaluated approaches for incorporating these bias assessments into the evidence synthesis. So, okay, here we go. So first of all, I'd like to thank all my co-authors listed here who gave important input into the content of the chapter and also to the writing. And you see here the chapter outline, and this is also the topics that I'm going to cover now. So starting with frameworks. In the book, we consider two broad frameworks for how you can incorporate risk of bias assessments into your evidence synthesis. And they are on two different extremes of the spectrum. So one approach often used is what we call risk of bias algorithms. And so the advantages of these are you get a clear set of rules and procedures, often very extensive, that you go through, and an example is shown here in this diagram, that you go through and you evaluate each study for a whole range of potential biases, and then include or exclude the study, often based on whether the decision tool tells you that that bias is present or absent. So the advantages is that it's this clear set of rules and procedures, and that should mean that the bias assessment is replicable, and that it should be objective. So the weaknesses are that usually these types of algorithms, though they're very extensive in what they ask you to assess, that they don't include thinking about the direction and magnitude of the bias and whether on that basis you should include or exclude a study. And for hazard identification in particular, thinking about this question, particularly of the direction, is very important. If you've got a positive study, for example, and you assess that the main biases will bias the study results towards the null, then that wouldn't change your interpretation. If you corrected for the bias, you would still conclude that the study was positive. So this is particularly important, we think, for hazard identification, is to think about the direction and, if possible, also the magnitude of the bias. These algorithms then tend to exclude many informative studies, and that's also the sort of process that they go through, that you go through this funnel, and by the end of applying this algorithm, you just have this set of supposedly perfectly unbiased studies. And subject matter expertise is not prioritized. The idea is that anyone should be able to apply these algorithms, but then that means you lose potentially a lot of information or understanding about whether a bias is likely to be relevant or not in that particular setting. So here's an example actually from the field I work in, low-dose radiation studies, that applied this sort of approach. So they had 29 studies, and when they applied this type of algorithm, they concluded in the end that only 11 studies were high quality and could be used to inform the final interpretation of results. The rest were considered uninformative, often based on factors like dose error. And as we heard earlier, typically the dose error non-differential will bias towards the null. And so they excluded a lot of positive studies that were biased towards the null. They didn't take account of the direction or the magnitude of the bias. So they lost a lot of important information by applying that kind of algorithm. So on the other end of the spectrum, in these sorts of frameworks, then, is this idea of triangulation. So this, in contrast to the algorithms, really emphasizes retaining all informative studies in the final evaluation of what the body of evidence shows. So it really emphasizes corroboration, which is one of the Hill viewpoints. And it also emphasizes exploring heterogeneity between studies rather than just trying to minimize it. The idea being that you can actually exploit often this heterogeneity in order to give you some insights into biases. And you see, this is the example here, that you have studies with positive bias and studies with negative bias. And the idea is that if you contrast those sets of studies, that will give you some extra information on what the findings might be if you had a set of unbiased studies. So what's the weakness? Well, so a lot of people have been discussing the idea of triangulation. So far, there haven't been very specific examples laid out of actually how to use it more formally in practice. So that also tends to lack standardization, with then the criticism that it's potentially more subjective. As I said, not many examples yet of actually how to use it formally in evidence synthesis. We did apply it, though, something along the lines of triangulation to our set, or that same set of low-dose radiation epidemiological studies that were reviewed by that other group. In this case, we had 26 eligible studies. By doing a systematic bias analysis, but really thinking about the direction and magnitude of the bias, we evaluated that actually there were only 4 positive studies with potential positive bias, and therefore the majority of the studies could be included in the final analysis. And we did a meta-analysis with and without these studies, and essentially came to the same conclusions. So in the book, then, what we recommend is what we call a third way. So something between the 2 extremes of this algorithmic approach and this triangulation, something that builds on those 2 strategies laid out with these 3 steps here. So the first step that we recommend is defining key biases for the specific exposure outcome situation that you are going to be reviewing. So that the idea is then that you limit the biases that you look at. You don't include every single bias that might possibly exist in the world, but you really try to think about major biases. And you can see the example here that we use in the book of going through this process of how it was done for the night shift work monograph. So they emphasized that exposure assessment quality was particularly important for the night shift work studies. So that would be a priority in reviewing biases, measurement error, but they thought that confounding would be of a lesser concern. On the other hand, quite a lot of the studies were case control studies, and therefore selection bias and recall bias was important to think about. So after laying out what you think are the key biases for the study, you can then use the methods that were just described by the previous presenters from chapters 3 to 5 that provide all these indirect and direct approaches for assessing potential biases in each study, with the recommendation that you determine the direction and magnitude of the bias wherever possible. And then summarize the findings for each study in a bias assessment summary table, which I'll show you in a minute. So you see the idea here of laying out what they think are the potential key confounders, again, for night shift work. And they talk about the direction of the confounding, and that they therefore think that the direction of confounding is likely to be away from the null. So here's an example of a bias summary table then. So this is returning to the opium studies example. And this was a meta-analysis that was carried out to support the monograph and a systematic bias analysis. And you can see that they determined that selection bias and information bias were really the key sources that should be considered. And they reviewed each study and evaluated what they thought the direction might be, and that's determined by the arrows here. So this table summarizes transparently what the reviewers thought about presence or absence of bias. So if there's no, if the cells are blank, it means they don't think that there's material bias, and what the directions might be. And this then enables you to look at potential subsets of studies that can be contrasted because they've got biases in different directions, and that you can contrast their sets of results in a formal stratified meta-analysis or forest plots to evaluate how those biases might have impacted the overall findings. So this is the step 3 then, is assessing how the key biases influence the study findings. So you can identify subsets of studies with and without key biases and compare them, identify subsets of studies with biases in opposing directions. That's really the official use of the idea of triangulation, and then assess consistency of the results of these subsets of studies. And you see here an example for red meat and colorectal cancer, where we've got the cohort studies, meta-analytic result, and the case control studies determined to have different biases in different directions. And so then you can compare these two summary estimates, and it gives you an indication of what the triangulated meta-analytic result might be. So we also then cover in the book, in this chapter, the issue of multiple bias analysis. And that's when you have multiple biases operating within the same study. This is a complex topic and not something that we entirely solved, I would say, particularly if you're working with published data. But we do provide some general suggestions. So again, thinking about what directions the biases act in. If they both act in the same direction and they assume to act independently, then you might be able to make some assumptions about the total bias in that circumstance. If they act in different directions, that is when it becomes more complicated. Some recommendations which also come from Matt Fox's book in his section on multiple bias analyses, that target adjusted multiple bias analyses are generally not recommended. So that would be an E-value type approach, but where you've got multiple biases operating together. But that a bias level sensitivity analysis could be used. So essentially that's a sequential approach of adjusting for the biases using those types of sensitivity analyses you've just seen. The recommendation when doing this is to adjust in the reverse order that the biases are likely to occur within the study. So if we think that typically confounding will be in the underlying study population, and then you may select individuals, introduce selection bias, and then measure things on them and introduce measurement error. If you're going to do a multiple bias adjustment, you do it in the opposite direction, adjust for measurement errors first, and so on. So there is a worked example in the book conducted by Alex Kyle, including his R code for doing it in Annex 3. So in summary then, our third way approach for incorporating bias assessments into evidence synthesis, these are our recommendations. So we do recommend writing out a pre-specified plan for major biases, but for the specific exposure outcome. So really thinking through what are the major biases for your particular scenario. The advantage and the recommendation then is that this sort of approach retains all the informative studies in the review process. And you use the tools that we laid out in the previous chapters to try and assess the direction and, if possible, the magnitude of bias, and summarize that, and then use that summary to gain insights from both the heterogeneity between the studies and look for corroboration across studies. So what are the challenges and opportunities still with this approach? So it's not guaranteed a clear-cut answer. You could certainly have scenarios where the biases don't behave nicely and it's difficult still to draw firm conclusions from your subsets of studies. We have to acknowledge that, but at least that should be transparent, that it may not be possible to rule out confounding or bias in this set of studies. We certainly think that the methods for multiple biases working with published data are limited currently, and we would appreciate some more development of those. Can be, of course, time consuming to conduct this type of multiple bias analysis, particularly if you've got a lot of studies. But I think increasingly two things may help us here. Firstly, as you'll hear in a minute in Chapter 7, that we're really encouraging authors to include these bias assessments themselves in the original study publications, and that will greatly, I think, improve the original publications, but also improve the review processes. And also, I think, increasingly we will find that AI methods can do a lot of the more routine work of a systematic review, selecting papers and extracting data from them, and that leaves the epidemiologists the more important job, which we're better at doing than just extracting numbers from hundreds of papers, which is actually to think very carefully about the bias assessment methods. So thank you for your attention, and I will now turn over, too many things at once, hang on. So I will now turn over to our final speaker, Professor Guseva-Canu, who is going to talk about study reporting considerations to facilitate these types of bias assessments.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. Sorry for this. I'm delighted to present you the chapter 7, which is on reporting consideration to facilitate quantitative bias assessment when authors have access to original data. And I do this presentation on behalf of my colleagues and authors, Lynn Fritchie, Terry Boyle, and Bridget Lynch from Australia, and Scott Weihenthal from Canada. This chapter has a very different approach from the previous ones because the target audience is researchers who have access to individual data, but do not have the ability to change the study design. What we want to provide is the information for those whose goal is to undertake themselves quantitative bias analysis on their study and avoid the discussion session saying that any bias are likely to have moved to the results closer to the new value, which sometimes we still find in the discussions of published papers. The other goal is also to ensure that the study can be used in future systematic reviews, like Amy presented, which include quantitative bias analysis and simplify the reviewer's work when looking for the hazard identification. In this chapter, we explain what information researchers need to obtain and report in order to reach these two goals. When this chapter could be useful to read? It is useful to read when you are analyzing study data and you do not have the option to change the study design because you are using study from an international or national consortium, and it's not your data. So it's not possible to modify the study design or to improve the data quality because data are from medical records or historical data. It is also useful when data collection in your study was complete and it's not possible anymore to change it. What this chapter is not about, it does not cover checklists and tools which are used and sometimes recommended for risk of bias assessment, like Newcastle-Ottawa tool for bias assessment, or Robbins, or some other tools that you could find in the literature. These tools are useful, but their drawbacks is that do not give a quantitative estimate of the direction and magnitude of the bias. How the chapter 7 is structured, it mimics pretty well the overall organization of the book. It starts with introduction, then it introduces graphical approaches to identify bias with a reference to chapter 2 presented by Matt Fox. Then we are presenting consideration regarding confounding bias with reference to chapter 3. On information bias on exposure and outcome misclassification, and then selection bias before the conclusion. The chapter 2 presents the main principles, which are actually 8, when constructing and presenting directed acyclic graph to facilitate the bias assessment. These principles can be applied at the study analysis stage to explicitly describe assumption, but they can also be applied in evaluating potential sources of bias when they were not assessed in the initial analysis. In this subsection of the chapter 7, we present operational examples to facilitate how this reporting principle should be followed and how we could illustrate their application, with one example regarding the exposure to red meat and colorectal cancer. And you can see how complex could be the DAG, directed acyclic graph. And another example regarding the exposure characterization, exposure measurement bias with an example regarding water arsenic concentration and cancer. The subsections 7.3 to 7.5 cover what the issues is, and so we remind what is the definition of the bias, selection, measurement errors, and misclassification and confounding, and in this volume you can find more information. So there is also the reference to other sections to find more details on how to deal with this bias and estimate it quantitatively. We also provide a brief description of each method and examples of how to do the method and any relevant statistical packages and even scripts available to do yourself this bias analysis. In all this subsection, we also provide a summary table like this one, listing the data which should be reported to facilitate the use of methods. For example, here you see the example regarding the subsection 3 on measurement error and in exposure and outcome misclassification, and regarding on the type of the exposure variable, there are reporting consideration, which could be sensitivity and specificity with relevant references, or additional information like validity of the exposure measurement method used. Another example is the extraction summary table regarding selection bias. And again, you can see that if we want to focus a particular source of selection bias like loss to follow-up, we recommend to report rates of loss to follow-up in key subgroups of interest stratified by exposure status assessed as baseline. And of course, again, we provide the reference to the relevant sections, corresponding sections in the book. So in conclusion, we hope that this chapter will assist researchers in undertaking quantitative bias assessment in their own study. We also hope that it will encourage the authors to use existing large cohorts to apply newer conceptual and statistical methods to address causal questions, that they will include quantitative bias assessment as an integral component of every epidemiological study, and that this practice will facilitate stronger systematic reviews and hazard identification by ensuring that every published study contains the information required for quantitative bias assessment. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention and thank again my co-authors and colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. That was really helpful. And I'd like to start by thanking all of the panelists and the authors for their work. On a personal note, this makes my job a lot easier. And I know these methods have certainly been useful for monograph evaluations in the past. And this book will likely make it much, much easier to be incorporated into future evaluations. As a reminder to the audience, the book can be downloaded via our website, and we'll be posting a link towards the end of the Q&A session. With that in mind, I'm going to start with a question for David, as I'm aware he may have to move on soon. And this question comes from Nathan DeBono regarding negative control outcomes. Can you elaborate some more ways to relax the equi-confounding assumption? And for example, if tobacco smoking as an unmeasured confounder is weaker or stronger cause of emphysema than a given cancer outcome, is it possible to somehow account or adjust estimates for this difference in the confounding corrected association? A technical one to start off with.
Yeah, so taking two situations. In chapter 3, we're focused on settings where the reviewer doesn't have the individual study data at hand. So let me start with that. In that setting, when we're interested in using a negative control outcome to assess for the presence of confounding. So for confounding detection, we don't require this what's called equiconfounding assumption, that the relationship between the unmeasured confounder and the negative control outcome is equal, let's say on a risk difference scale, to the magnitude of the unmeasured confounder with the cancer outcome of particular interest. If we're simply looking for evidence to support the or to nullify the concern that there's unmeasured confounding, we don't require that those are equal magnitudes of association. If you want to indirectly adjust for and correct the confounding using simple tools, then you need those two arrows to be equal in magnitude. Now, let me just pivot. If you actually have this study data in hand, there's been a lot of nice work recently by Eric Chechen and his group with one approach called the control outcome calibration approach, another called single proxy controls. Those allow you to do adjustment without, again, requiring the assumption of equiconfounding. They're very nice tools, but those do require you to have the data in hand.
Thanks, David. The next question's more directed towards Matt. It kind of covers two related questions from Kurt Strafe and Mary Elise Parent regarding empirical evidence when drawing DAGs. Firstly, what is the empirical evidence that a family history of CRC reduces red meat consumption? And how does this link into a broader question on the level of evidence required when adding nodes or arrows to DAGs?
So let me take those in reverse order, because I think the second one speaks to the first one, and then hopefully I can answer that one. So DAGs represent our best understanding of the data generating mechanism. Just putting something into a DAG does not make it true. We have to go with our best understanding. And if it turns out that we don't really understand the data generating mechanism all that well, it often means we have more work to do before we can truly get to the associations or the effects that we're most interested in. In DAGs, drawing an arrow between two variables is generally a weaker assumption than failure to draw one between two, and that just has to do with the way that it would guide us towards the things that we should and shouldn't choose to adjust for. So typically, the advice would be if you're unsure, draw the arrow, and go from there. But again, it's really important to emphasize putting it into a DAG doesn't make it true. Now, once you've drawn the DAG, you can look at your data, and there's a set of assumptions that are present in the DAG that you can test in your data. Testing it and finding out that the data is consistent with your DAG doesn't make your DAG correct, but it is supportive of the idea that your DAG is correct. The converse is also true. If you expect to see a relationship based on your DAG and you don't see it in your data, doesn't necessarily mean your DAG is wrong. It could be there's some other source of measurement error or other source of bias that is leading to this. So generally the advice is put the arrow in, if you are unsure. But often we draw multiple DAGs just to see whether our data are consistent with different sets of assumptions. So then speaking specifically to the issue of the history of colorectal cancer, so it's important to make clear anything that is behavioral, and many things that are biological too, but certainly anything that's behavioral is going to be specific to the population being studied. So there isn't a universal DAG. So the idea that a history of colorectal cancer would change consumption of red meat is going to be specific to the study question. So I did not mean to imply that putting it into that DAG there implied it would always be true. Simply saying that it could be true in a particular case, and it could go in different directions, right? It could be that for reasons we haven't specified and really should be specified, that there are reasons why having a family history might cause you to consume more red meat that are related to just family practices, or the opposite, that knowing that one has a family history, one would consume less because one assumes that it is related to colorectal cancer. So there's no one answer to the question, and there's no one DAG to describe it all. We generally put things in that we think are likely to explain the data, but just putting it into a DAG doesn't make it true.
Thanks, Matt. The next question is for Leslie. Again, Kurt Struve has asked some useful questions, and Igor Buston has added some useful clarifications about non-differential misclassification, particularly in the context of linear models or continuous ones or non-binary ones. How confident can we still be that the bias is on average towards the null for non-binary studies? And how useful is it for a study to be evaluated? How useful is that assumption if we're only evaluating one study? And how useful is that assumption if we're evaluating multiple studies?
Okay, Kurt, thanks for the question. I think the point is that it's really an expectation under certain conditions, that being the error is a classical error, that the bias on average, or in more statistical terms, our expectation is that it's going to be towards the null. But in any one particular study, which is one realization of an infinite number of experiments, sort of, so you really don't know whether the bias in fact is, whether your estimate is truly biased. But we do know that the tendency is for it to be biased towards the null under a classical error model, not under a Bergsonian error model, which is an important point, that in that case, we don't really expect it to see a bias towards the null.
So as a personal add-on to that one, if you had multiple studies as part of an evaluation where you expected this kind of misclassification, would you be slightly more comfortable applying that average bias assumption?
Well, if they're all having classical error, then and they're all positive, then you might be more confident in saying, yeah, that the bias towards the null would only increase your confidence that this is a causal association.
Great, thank you, Leslie. The next one, if Matt's still on the call, is the book uses some useful examples from the IARC monographs relating to cancer hazard identification. How useful is this book for other disease outcomes?
Yeah, so DAGs are useful for any time you're trying to get at cause and effect. There are even examples of cases from randomized trials where it's helpful to draw out a DAG when we want to study, different mediating pathways or things like that. So DAGs are useful for any time we're trying to assess cause and effect from data, particularly observational data, and we have concerns about confounding or measurement error or or selection bias. So any time we're trying to assess cause and effect, almost any epidemiologic study, DAGs are helpful.
Useful point. Any other input from any of the other group on the utility beyond cancer instance?
Yeah, I can recall what was discussed at the workshop, and I don't think it really made it much into the book, but I think one unique feature of cancer studies is that in general, our outcome is very well measured, and it's not self-reported in most studies. And so the attention in the book paid to outcome misclassification is probably given less importance than it might be for other outcomes that are more difficult to measure or are repeated or required to be repeated in order to get the measurement. So that might be an area where additional considerations would play into the importance of the relative sources of bias.
Thank you, Mary. Just scrolling through some of the other questions to see if there are any other ones we can do. The other question, and I think this was fairly well covered already, but relates to risk of bias tools. We often get asked within the monographs why we're not using risk of bias tools as explicitly as some other groups use. What's your standard answer on this one, Mary?
Yes. So in our preamble and in the latest revision of the preamble, which was in 2018, there was some discussion about the use of algorithmic tools. I think the concern was that some of them essentially automatically downgraded observational epidemiology because it's not a randomized trial. And the advisors that we had in our advisory group really felt that that was the wrong approach to take, to sort of downgrade these observational studies and then allow them to claw their way back to respectability. So I think that really led, to the lack of use of these approaches. Instead, I think historically the monographs have implicitly used many of the approaches that are described in the bias book, like negative control outcomes, triangulation of evidence. A great example of there is arsenic and drinking water, or arsenic exposure, where we had drinking water studies in populations and occupational studies, both of lung cancer, with very different sources of bias. And there, the working group explicitly identified the major bias concerns, triangulated the evidence across the studies having different sources of bias. So I think, generally speaking, the history of the monographs has been to avoid checklists, to make use of subject matter expertise, which allows the experts to quickly hone in on the major concerns for bias from all three domains: confounding, selection bias, and measurement error and misclassification, and then to use that evidence to transparently judge the strength of evidence and ability to rule out confounding concerns or bias concerns.
We have another question, a late incoming question, about outcome misclassification and how it's often addressed in studies of prostate cancer. Does anyone want to talk through the example in the book and how that can be addressed?
Well, we did talk about, as I recall, prostate cancer as an example of where there would be outcome misclassification, in the sense that some positive exams are really not going to go towards a malignancy. So it can be an important concern, certainly in prostate studies. But as Mary said earlier, I think for the most part, for cancer, we have many more examples where there's very little uncertainty in diagnosis of cancers when we're working from, cancer registry data. So anyway, but that certainly is one example, prostate cancer, where it's a real concern.
Thank you, Leslie. And on that note, I'll just share the last slide, which gives some guidance on where this can be found, the book. This can be found via the IARC website, and soon will be also available in print, though we're just in the process of getting that ready. Also, if you liked what you heard, you're also welcome to join the IARC Monographs newsletter mailing list to receive news on the IARC Monographs program and the evaluations that will very likely use some of the tools described in this book. So thank you all for joining, and again, thank you to the panelists for their excellent talks and their excellent work on the book.